Actually, no. Good afternoon, everybody. Waminjeka, welcome. Firstly, let me acknowledge the land that we meet on today is the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging and honour our great history in this most beautiful of lands. My name is Monique Ryan. I am your Member for Parliament. In 2022, we made history together. In 2025, Kooyong will become one of the most important electorates in this country. The decision that this community makes next year will again change Australian political, social and economic history, and you and I will be a part of that. When I stood for Parliament in 2021-22, I committed to represent Kooyong on the things that mattered most to us: our climate, our environment, our economy and our children's futures. And I pledged to you that I would do that with transparency, with accountability and with integrity. I left my career as the Director of Neurology at the Royal Children's Hospital, as a medical researcher and as an academic, because I knew that our community deserved better than politics as usual. Politics by career politicians. Politics driven by parties and by individual self-interest and ideology, rather than by evidence, collaboration and pragmatism. I never anticipated, and I remain awed by the extent and the strength and the generosity of Kooyong's response in 2022. The whole country came and watched as our community came together to effect change, to elect one of us, not one of them. This community sent the most powerful message possible to Australia's political parties. Ignore climate change, disregard the rights of women, and mortgage our children's futures for your personal ambitions and your donors' profits at your electoral peril. The people of Kooyong were heard. On election night in 2022, the incoming Prime Minister committed to responding to that message. And so he's listening. G'day, Alba. And so the 47th Parliament has enacted some of the legislation that our community campaigned for. And this would not have happened had the government not faced the largest crossbench ever seen in this country, and a consensus from so many Australian electorates that we wanted change. Firstly, on climate. The Climate Change Act passed in September 2022. It cemented our commitment to the Paris Agreement. I moved an amendment to that bill, and together with the rest of the crossbench, ensured that the government committed to a floor target of 43% emission reductions on 2005 levels by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. That was the first time that Australia ever legislated a commitment to climate action. Parliament passed a number of other significant pieces of climate legislation in this term: the Safeguard Mechanism, the Nature Repair Market, the Nature Positive Plan, the Capacity Investment Scheme, and the very first tranche of what has now become a three-tranche revised Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. All of those have incrementally improved our climate and environmental protections. The other major electoral issue in 2022 was the affront to common sense and to decency that was the absence of a national watchdog for corrupt behaviour by public servants and politicians. The refusal of the last government to establish a national anti-corruption commission reflected its disinterest in scrutiny, but it wasn't just the Morrison government. The Labor opposition had no policy for an anti-corruption commission before independents made it a key issue in 2022. Establishment of a NAC was front and centre for our community at that last election. And the power of our campaign for integrity, transparency and accountability brought the change that we sought. The NAC was established in 2023. It's not yet working quite as well as we would like, but it will become a foundational institution of government integrity. The Albanese government would not have made those issues front and centre and so prominent in our legislative schedule in the first part of this parliamentary term had it not seen what happened in 2022. You sent me to represent you in Canberra on the issues that mattered to you, and I have done that. But we've had other wins as well. As an independent in the 47th Parliament, I've learnt how to negotiate, how to work across the floor. And I've worked with government and with other crossbenchers in the House and the Senate to secure the outcomes that we want and need. On climate, I pushed long and hard for the government to legislate vehicle emission standards to get our transport emissions down, so that Australians could save on fuel costs and the health impact of the most polluting cars in the first world. After years of opposition from the automotive industry, that legislation passed this year. It was a big thing, and we're already seeing new and cheaper expanded range of EV models on the market. The number of EVs sold in Australia rose from 8,000 in 2022 to 100,000 last year. I also campaigned successfully for changes in the rules around the luxury car tax discount to make electric and hybrid vehicles more affordable. I contributed to policy planning around the need to integrate EVs with our power grid, and vehicle-to-grid capacity will now be enabled by the end of this year. Most recently, I've been advocating on the anomaly of oversized SUVs, mega utes, still being exempt from the car tax. Watch that space. On the environment, I've successfully moved amendments to legislation on native forest logging. To stop seismic blasting of our oceans, I've presented a petition to Parliament, I moved a private member's motion, and last week I presented a private member's bill. On gas fracking and processing in the Beetaloo Basin and at Middle Arm in the Northern Territory, I've repeatedly asked questions in Parliament. We ultimately secured a Senate inquiry into the matter, and recently the government paused new approvals of those projects. I was elected on integrity in government, and in my very first week in Parliament, I moved a disallowance motion, baby's new tool, and stopped one of the Morrison's government's most particularly dodgy grant schemes. Over the following few months, I saw it firsthand, the influence of lobbyists at every level of access to government. I saw the 15 lobbyists for every member of Parliament walking the halls of Parliament House. Only 2 or 3 out of those 15 are on the lobbyist register. I saw the lack of transparency about who meets with who, when and why. I saw the refusal to open ministerial diaries. I saw the revolving door, which sees every mining minister since 2001 move straight from government into highly paid positions in the mining industry. Which has seen senior politicians and public servants and prime ministers receive lucrative positions in the defence industry within weeks of leaving jobs which have had oversight over government procurement in defence. This corrodes public trust in government decision-making. Good governance has to be transparent. So that's why I introduced a private member's bill for legislation which would regulate all lobbying activity within Parliament House, would open ministerial diaries and close that revolving door. The Clean Up Politics Act has now been introduced twice to Parliament. It has not been well received by the major parties. The government has repeatedly refused to allow it to be debated in the House, but with the support of Senator David Pocock, I secured a Senate inquiry in 2023, and that inquiry strongly supported the need for this legislation. It's an important reform, potentially nearly as important as establishment of the NAC. And I will continue to advocate for it and for transparency in government decision-making until we can shame this Parliament into joining the rest of the world in regulating lobbying. As an independent, I've been able to listen to the voices of constituents and bring to the national conscience the things that matter to you. In 2024, I conducted an electorate-wide cost of living survey. It received thousands of responses. I've also had thousands of conversations at pop-up offices and while door knocking. So many of you have joined me at those pop-up offices and on that door knocking, which we've done throughout the 3 years, not just as a pre-election ploy. And we've had conversations which have gone to the heart of people's concerns, which are too often now about the cost of living, about the shortage of housing, and about the surmounting HECS debts of the younger generations. So I have been vocal in my advocacy about those issues and in my attempts to assist home buyers and renters. I will continue to advocate for more housing supply in this country. There has to be better housing supply as well. I know that the next generation fears that it won't ever be able to buy a home without the bank of mum and dad. I was one of the first federal politicians in this term to push this government to make its stage 3 tax cuts more fair. I will continue to advocate for meaningful, evidence-based reform of our tax system to address intergenerational inequity. In real terms, the cost and significance of HECS debts has rocketed in recent years. After that issue was raised with me, by students, by graduates, but also by their parents, I took on the unfair HECS system. Young people are putting off buying homes and starting families because of the weight of their HECS debts. Fewer school graduates are starting tertiary degrees. This at a time when we're desperately short of nurses, teachers, mental health professionals and engineers. So I talked to academics and economists about how our tertiary education system needs to change. I asked questions in Parliament, met with the Minister repeatedly, got to the stage where he was running every time he saw me coming, spoke in the media about the issue and collected almost 300,000 signatures on a petition asking for change to the system. That petition was the largest in Australian history. And we won. The pressure was just simply too much for the government to withstand. And earlier this year, it announced that it would change indexation, wiping out almost $3 billion in HECS debts for 3 million Australians. Last month, it announced that it would discount HECS debts by 20% if it's re-elected, which is good, but there's a lot more to do in this space. We need the government to set fee levels which are reasonable and fair, that reflect the cost of degrees but also the earning capacity of graduates. We have to change the way that indexation of HECS is applied. It is ripping graduates off. We have to reverse that unfair Morrison-era doubling of the cost of some degrees, and we have to extend support for students who are undertaking practical placements. I came to Parliament as a paediatric neurologist, as a medical researcher and academic, with a lifelong commitment to better health and disability care, and it has been an absolute privilege to be a member of the parliamentary committees on health and aged care and on the NDS. It's been a bit more challenging to be a member of the Parliamentary Committee on Nuclear, but we'll come to that. I've been able to bring my practical knowledge and expertise to Parliament and to make a difference on inquiries into long COVID, into diabetes and a number of inquiries into the NDIS. This year, landmark legislation to improve the NDIS passed the Parliament. I was the only member of the House to successfully move amendments to that legislation. That was after months of work with peak bodies, expert groups, the NDIA and the government. I've also been able to make practical and pragmatic suggestions to the government on healthcare policy. And the best example of that was my revival of a suggestion from the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee to the Morrison government, that it increased the duration of scripts and permitted 60 days of medications for patients who are on stable doses of common medications for long periods. I brought that recommendation to the attention of the Minister for Health and then withstood the backlash from the lobbyists representing pharmacy owners who tend to put profits before patients. This was the first of many cost of living policies that I've pursued in the last couple of years. It came into force in 2023. It has reduced the cost of prescription medicine and halved visits to GPs and to pharmacies for millions of Australians. There have been a huge number of other issues which have been brought to the attention of me and of members of my team in the electorate office, which we have acted on locally and nationally. Thousands of responses to calls for assistance with visas, passports, aged care, childcare, the NDIS. Locally, I've been a voice for our community regarding the state government's housing rezoning and densification schemes. I've also advocated for state and federal government for long overdue completion of the Hawthorn to Box Hill bike trail. When the local government and the local state members are sidelined, I have the ability to speak for our community. Federally, I've undertaken advocacy on the multiple hardships created by the cost of living crisis. I've taken on the duopolies and market controls of the supermarkets, airlines and insurance industries. I've advocated for better consumer protections, and I've successfully pushed the government to act on scams. I've advocated for medication shortages, approvals and funding, on vaccine availability, better funding of medical research, for more generous parental leave and superannuation attached to that, for paid domestic violence leave and better funding for family violence centres, for more funding for quality early childhood education. I also pushed successfully, and in isolation, but successfully, for a change in the way that we award costs around sexual harassment in the workplace and the legal cases associated with that. It was important to ensure that women could have their voices heard. I successfully pushed the government for funding of Trove, a publicly accessible repository of the nation's history. Kooyong loves Trove. And I also pushed with Bob Catter, in fact, for more funding of the Australian Bone Marrow Donor Registry, and we were able to secure a significant amount of money for that. I've consistently tried to secure better protections for refugees and asylum seekers, and joined in the push for increases to Commonwealth rental assistance. These have been enacted in both of the last two budgets. But our support payments for vulnerable Australians are still far too low. We keep people in poverty at their cost, but also at ours. I've asked the government to critically examine the productivity and the economic cost of that poverty, and that's one for the next term. These are all issues which were brought to my team by you. We said that politics was going to be about community, and my commitment has been to serve the community of Kooyong. And with your support, and the support of my dedicated, hard-working, brilliant team, we have represented Kooyong on the things that have mattered to you. So what now? Before I was elected in 2021-22, I was often asked whether we could avoid global warming to the 1.5 degrees relative to pre-industrial values that people were concerned about. And in 2021, I did say repeatedly to people, I hope that we could. We hit it this year. And globally, the impact of that change is already manifesting with extreme weather events, warming of our seas, bushfires and floods. We're already seeing the cost of that, the increasing cost of food, of insurances, of housing construction, and the impact on the health and safety of so many populations globally, on the future of our children. And yet, the Albanese government has committed to a future gas strategy which will keep gas in our energy mix to 2050. It has passed legislation allowing the dumping of greenhouse gases as carbon dioxide off our coastlines, despite carbon capture and storage being a failed technology with extreme environmental implications. That is a pure cover for more gas approvals. The Albanese government has signed off on 28 new coal and gas projects. It has refused to commit to a duty of care on climate and to incorporating climate considerations into its approval process for large-scale mining and other projects. This week's annual climate statement reflected the fact that our emissions are actually falling much more slowly than we need them to. And that's remembering that we don't count in those statements the global impact of the coal, oil and gas that we continue to export, and from which we receive manifestly inadequate income. This government still receives more money from HECS than it does from the PRRT, our petroleum super tax. It is a disgrace, and the Albanese government has still not committed to taxing our fossil fuel exports adequately in the future. The government has also failed to pass this, despite many promises to the contrary, to pass the second and third tranches of its flagship environmental legislation, the EPBC Act. Just last week, the PM pulled the EPA and related legislation from Parliament, apparently because of a concern regarding their political ramifications in Western Australia. Time and time again, we see the government put short-term political expediency ahead of the better interests of our country. The government has established a National Anti-Corruption Commission, but preventing corruption is only one of the many pillars of ensuring integrity in government. Political donations are a really important part of elections. They're inevitable, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be transparent. I've advocated for real-time disclosure and for greater transparency around political donations. After almost 3 years of sustained pressure from the crossbench for meaningful electoral reform, the government recently rammed through legislation which will give the major parties much more taxpayer-funded support, while making it much, much harder for independents, especially new independents, to be elected. With that legislation, the ALP and the Coalition openly colluded in their own self-interest. It was stunningly cynical. The crossbench of the 47th Parliament has put up in front of it a number of integrity measures, not just my Clean Up Politics Act. There's been Helen Haynes's pork barrelling bill and legislation for improved whistleblower protections. Sophie Scomps's Job for Mates bill to prevent government appointments of friends and colleagues without due scrutiny. Zali Steggall's bill for truth in political advertising. Kate Chaney's bill for reform of electoral donations. Together, this raft of integrity measures would go a really long way towards restoring due process and trust in our political system. Last week, I was asked a question about this in question time. It was the first time since 2007 that a question has been asked in question time of a non-minister. I turned that question to the government and I asked them when they would debate these vital integrity measures. They didn't answer. We know the answer to that question. They'll do it only when we make them. The crossbench of the 47th Parliament has charted a new path. Time and time again, we have risen in the House to speak on matters of importance to our constituents, to raise issues of national concern and debate legislation. Politics is about the contest of ideas, what's possible, what's feasible, what's electable, but it's also about what is seen. And when you learn when you're there is that there are many important issues which never come to the attention of the Parliament. I've learned to use my position to raise issues of importance to Kooyong's constituents, to set them on the national agenda, to support practical solutions and to get the best legislation through negotiation, amendment and debate. Heraclitus said, and a wise woman repeated to me this week, that you never step in the same river twice. The 2025 election is going to be very different from that of 2022. Instead of the general dissatisfaction with a self-satisfied Prime Minister who utterly failed to recognise the country's frustration with how he represented us on climate, on integrity, on gender equity and on social justice, we now have a Labor government which has disappointed us with its timidity and its lack of focus, which has done too little too slowly, which has kowtowed to vested interests, to the minerals industry, to oil and gas producers, to the Murdoch press, and which has pursued at times populist policies at the expense of real change, which failed communities like ours when we committed to the Voice referendum and hoped for a better future, which has responded to the belligerence and the negativity of Peter Dutton by joining him in a race to the bottom on immigration and on refugees. The recent collusion of the major parties on electoral reform has made it clear that their greatest fear is not the effect of accumulating intergenerational inequity. is not the real and manifesting impact of climate change. It's not cost of living pressures and the housing stress which occupy the thoughts of so many Australians all day, every day, as they worry about how to pay the gas and electricity bill, about how to pay for the shopping, about how to pay for their rent or their mortgage. What the political parties are talking about and thinking about is how to keep power. They fear that the winds of change are blowing. They fear a new type of parliament which is truly representative, which includes diverse individuals who are motivated to serve, who are beholden only to their constituents and not to the vested interests that pop up party structures. They fear a future with a large dynamic crossbench in which there will be no turn and turnabout for the two-party structure, only practical solutions in the public interest, conducted and developed in the full light of day. So, I'm asked endlessly about the prospects of a hung parliament. What will I do? What will I ask for? I will ask for a representative parliament. I'm asked who I'll support if there's not a one-party majority. I will support my constituents. I'm asked about what policies I'll put in front of a minority government. And that will be policies that are in the public interest and which will deliver a fairer and more prosperous, hospitable world. Policies on climate to stop new fossil fuel developments. To ensure that we get a fair payment for our exports. To support the fair transition of fossil fuel industries in Australia to those based on net zero renewables. There is such urgency to this need. Our energy policy is the enabler of our transition to net zero emissions. We have to take the fastest, most affordable and safest route to reliable, clean energy sources, able to support not just our homes but also our expanding industrial base. That transition demands that we electrify everything. To charge our electric vehicles, buses and trucks, to replace gas heating and cooking in homes and in industrial processing, to fuel new green alternatives such as the production of steel, hydrogen and ammonia. Our homes and our small businesses are going to have to be supported to power themselves with solar, to secure their energy stores with batteries and EVs, and to benefit from the greater capacity and lesser cost of a distributed energy network. We have to support investment in the transition to this country becoming the green energy superpower that we could and should be in the 21st century. Energy is a major household cost and it is a huge burden on many household budgets and on business overheads. It's also a significant contributor to the measure of inflation. Addressing the cost of energy will help address the rising cost of living for all Australians. We also need policy on integrity. We've learned over the last few years that democracy can never be taken for granted. My Clean Up Politics bill will be the focus of my work in this area, and I will work with the government and with my crossbench colleagues on electoral donation reform, truth in political advertising, transparency around government appointments, and whistleblower protections. I'm going to hold the government accountable for its spending and for how we treat the most vulnerable in our country. What we did in 2022 was truly historic. We changed Kooyong. In my first speech in Parliament, I explained to our nation that Kooyong had voted for them, for those affected by fire and floods, by rising seas and by drying lands. In 2025, we're going to do that again, but I'm going to need your help. It is not going to be easy. There's a lot of wood to chop. a lot of water to carry. But we stand on the precipice of a great transformation, and our country needs us to lead them towards it. It is in 2025, with your help, we're going to change Australia. Thank you.